Hello everyone and welcome to Ask a Scientist Live, our third episode. Apologies for the late running of tonight's scheduled stream, but we're ready to go with Agroecology, Can We Feed the World Without Destroying It? And now over to your host for this evening, Jordan Raine.
Hello everyone, welcome to the latest in this Ask a Scientist Live series, Agroecology, Can We Feed the World Without Destroying It? I'm Jordan, I'm an environmental journalist, former environment editor at The Conversation, fingers in a few pies on Extinction Rebellion, including XR scientists, but most importantly, I'm an amateur agroecology enthusiast. So I'm going to be joining you on this journey of discovery. And that brings me to the most important part of this, which is you. It's a real pleasure to have so many of you from around the world joining us, sending in questions, and I'm really looking forward to see what our panelists have to say. So speaking of that, let's see who we'll be chatting to. Let's start with Alain. Could you tell everyone a bit about yourself?
Yes, sure. First, good afternoon, everybody. I am an agronomist and an ecologist, and so very naturally agroecologist. A professor at the University of Louvain in Belgium for 20 years. I gained global experience on agricultural and food issues, thanks to consultancy with FAO, World Bank, European Commission, and also through scientific travels and contacts with colleagues. I'm currently Secretary General of Agroecology Europe, a European non-profit association for the promotion of agroecology. And I'm focusing my activities on the development of agroecological systems in commercial farms in Belgium and France.
Thank you very much, Alain. Let's go to Jyoti.
Hello. Unmute myself. Am I muted?
You are loud and clear.
Okay, great. It just says that. All right. So, hi, I'm Jyoti Fernandes. I'm a farmer in Dorset, but I'm a part of the Land Workers Alliance, which is a farmers union that's a part of La Via Campesina. We have 200 million peasant farmers around the world who are probably some of the best scientists, breeders, innovators in the world in figuring out how we're going to feed the world in the best way without destroying it.
Thank you, Jyoti. And we've also got Lynn. Do you want to say hello?
Hi everyone. Good afternoon. My name's Lynn Dix. I am an ecologist by training. I started my career working on the insects that visit flowers in hay meadows. So I've done a lot of work on bees and flies and insect conservation. But I now work in agroecology. I have a research group which is partly in the University of Cambridge and partly in the University of East Anglia. And we mostly work on how to ensure that agriculture particularly in its intensive, relatively industrial form, is as least damaging to biodiversity as it can be and as sustainable as it can be. We work on how to look after birds and insects in agricultural environments and how farmers can manage that system so that it's more productive but less damaging to wildlife. And that's me.
Thanks, Lynn. And last but not least, we have Marco.
Yeah, good evening, everybody. I'm very pleased to be here today. I have worked at the Joint Research Center, which is the in-house scientific arm of the European Commission, and I'm on sabbatical leave for that. And I've been on and off dealing with agroecology as a scientist, as a researcher, but also in the field, growing a bit of food myself, and everything on and off in my life experiences directly in various type of farming. And I've joined the Extinction Rebellion in Italy.
Thank you very much, Marco. Right, so let's get straight to it. Please do keep sending in your questions, and we'll bring them in as the show progresses. But we had some questions come in beforehand, and thank you for sending all those in. And so we're going to cut straight to it. So I'd like to pose this first one to you, Marco, if that's all right. V from University of Bristol asks, what's wrong with our farming system today, and how will not doing anything about it affect people 20 years down the line?
Yes, thank you. Practically everything is wrong with our farming system today. the first thing we could say is that the stop at the farm gate, and then there are aspects of that we could look at it at the whole system, farm to fork, so to say. When we stop at the farm gate and look at how we farm, there's a lot of things that have been based on mistakes that affect the environment, like labor and tilling, that destroy the soil and destroy microbiology of the soil and its structure, and create the condition for less absorption and more emission of carbon. Fertilizers, which is a mistake that was born by chemists in the 1800s, not realizing aspects of macrobiology of soil, giving health to the plants. All this is, of course, enhanced by our tendency to grow crops in monoculture, the size of farming has become huge, and the dependence on fossil fuel of the whole system. Now, if you look at beyond the farm, we have a whole system of imports and destructive practices abroad. Think about, for the UK, for example, is dependent for food and feed up to 40% of its requirements from abroad, and things that come in the form of feed for animals that are crops grown in areas deforested, like in the Amazon or other tropical areas. So basically, what happens if we continue like that? We have the total destruction of ecosystems, the annihilation of biological diversity. We are today in the 6th mass extinction. All of that has been estimated that in the situation as we are now, 75% of all ecosystems are altered or severely altered by human intervention. And if we go on like that, by 2050, we could have only 10% that's left unaltered and half of all wild animals gone. Now think that about of all biomass of mammals, 60% are livestock, 36% are human, and only 4% are mammals. We are losing insects, we are losing amphibians at a rate that is absolutely unprecedented. We have over 600 ocean dead zones, 250 more since 1992 because of fertilizers. So we increase biodiversity loss, and we not necessarily producing more. Most of industrial farming uses about 80% of land and from 70 to 80% of all energy, water, etc., but do not produce the food that we need. Most of the food is produced by small peasant farmers. They use a huge variety of plants and breeds of animals. The way we farm destroys life in the soil, and in spite of selected varieties, creates weakness in plants, so that we have maybe high yields, but we use pesticide and insecticides and so on and so forth. Now, a host of arthropods have developed resistance to insecticide in the last decades, so that agricultural losses have actually increased, and we are forced to use increasingly harder and stronger chemicals to stop them, like neonicotinoids, to name one class of insecticides that are very powerful, that affect pollinators a lot, and affect fish. Studies in fresh water have shown that up to 91% of fish is destroyed because of pesticide or the insecticides. So we are destroying our life base and not producing and risking a situation where we'll have vast areas of land not capable of producing enough food, enough healthy food. That could lead to, together with the effect of climate change, could lead to famines and wars. That's the situation we could head towards if we don't change radically the system. Now, agroecology can help that. It mimics nature by actually following the patterns of biogeochemical cycles and trophic chains in a way that we can develop more if there are more questions to actually the technicalities of agroecology. But the basic principle is that we mimic nature. And so we do not alter soils, we keep soil non-labored, non-tilled, and always covered with various ways of mulching and combining crops in polycultures that helps each other and maximize the use of both above ground and below ground richness. And I hope I've answered enough. We could be going on for ages. Thank you for now.
Brilliant. Thanks, Marco. Yeah, that sounds pretty daunting. I'd just like to send big apologies to our Instagram viewers who had connection problems at the beginning. So if you're joining late due to technical problems, then we're here to talk about agroecology and whether we can feed the world without destroying it. And please, if you have any questions for our scientists, then please do send them in. So Marco's just summarized really well the problem. Now let's pivot to the solution. And I'd like to go to Lynn here with a combined question from Keb or Seb, I'm not really sure, Bliss from the Netherlands, sorry if I butchered your name, and Valeria in London. So first of all, if there's anything you'd like to add on what agroecology actually is, please do feed in on that. And then I'd like you to answer this dual question. How can agroecology help us farm in a way which helps reverse the trend of biodiversity loss? And what are the main challenges and benefits for a farmer to transition to agroecology?
Okay, thanks for the question. So I'll start with Marco's already explained a bit about what agroecology is. I mean, for me, it's using the principles of nature, as he said, to farm more efficiently and more effectively. So in this, the principles of nature from ecology, from the science of ecology, is that you can design very, very productive systems which are complex. So we look at nature and what we see is large diversity of different species in complex interacting webs, and what they produce on the surface of it looks very stable. So you get these stable systems that are very intricate in their detail, and yet they continue to produce functions, they produce biomass, and in general, I mean, they can collapse, but in general they're surprisingly stable given their complexity. So agroecology is about trying to recreate that in a farming environment, and it's very knowledge intensive, and it's extremely different, very, very, very different from the conventional approach to farming that we have in large parts of the world today, because that conventional intensive industrial farming, if you like, has tended to simplify everything. It's gone for bigger fields, mechanized, simplistic, single crops on very large spaces so that you can have huge machines that harvest all one thing at one time on a very large scale. And that's completely the opposite from what you want to do if you do agroecology. You're interested in diversity and mixing crops together and farming on a relatively small scale, but being very productive. So that's the challenge we face. How do we transition from what we have in conventional, what are called conventional farming systems, towards a more agroecological system that mimics nature? So to answer the question, how do we move farming so it stops causing biodiversity loss? I think it's really important to say at the start, as Marco's already given some facts about this, biodiversity loss is severe. So we already have a quarter of the species on Earth have been assessed are threatened with extinction, and a global assessment that was published showed that it estimated that we're going to lose 1 million species out of an estimated 8.1 million that exist on Earth, or that we expect exist. We're going to lose 1 million of those in the coming decades. So we're facing this extinction crisis, and we know, and we've known for quite a long time, that agriculture is the main driver of that loss of species, of that decline. And it has these effects mostly because it takes habitat out. It removes natural habitat and replaces it with very simplified systems of food production, which do support species, but they don't support as many species as natural habitat does. So how can agriculture be part of reversing that trend? That's the question I think you're asking. I think there are two really key elements to what we have to do, or where we have to go now, from where we are now in the world, which is around 40% of all the world's land surface is under agriculture. We simply, and that's growing, especially in developing countries. It's actually not growing in many of the northern, say Europe, for example. The area of agricultural land is slightly decreasing now, but it's still growing. Agriculture is still expanding in lots of the world, and overall it's expanding. So the first thing we have to do is simply stop that. To reverse biodiversity loss, we have to stop agricultural expansion. We have to stop losing the natural habitats we have left. That's an absolute given. You can't do anything but that. That's really important. No more loss of natural habitat. And the second thing we need to do is to start to reclaim natural habitats. To actually reverse the trend, we need to reclaim some natural habitats. And the only way we can really see to do that, or one of the main ways, is by intensifying the production we have, particularly in areas where it's not very efficient. And this leads to a real difficult debate in conservation science, in agricultural sustainability, which is what's the most sustainable way to do that? How do you increase the production in the areas of agriculture we have so that you can actually free up more land? And there are several analyses. If you take a very large scale view of this, there are analyses which show that you get more species overall on a landscape scale or on a very large scale if you intensify agricultural production on a smaller area of land and you increase the land that's natural habitat. This is an approach called land sparing, and you get more species overall from doing that than if you allow more species to live in the agricultural land, which is an approach called land sharing. In fact, a recent analysis has shown that in theory, you can if you increase the crop yields around the world so that you fill something that's called the yield gap, which is all of the crops reach the yields that the maximum yields for that crop can attain in different parts of the world, and you optimize production globally, you can have the same amount of food produced on half of the agricultural land. So that's one way of thinking about it. But there are some really serious problems with that way of thinking about things. There's three problems actually with that way of thinking. One of the problems is that it moves everyone. If you do it through intensifying with chemicals, then it moves everyone in the world to the kind of conventional industrialized agriculture that we know degrades environments and causes biodiversity loss. And I think that's not really a direction we want to go in. The second problem is that it assumes that you can intensify agriculture a lot and you don't actually need nature to do this into productive farming. You can farm without nature. And that's simply wrong. As Marco has already implied, the nature in the soil is actually really important to the productivity of the land. I work on pollinators, and we know that wild pollinators are really important to the actual seed or fruit production for quite a lot for quite a lot of the world's major food crops. There's a famous statement, 1 in 3 mouthfuls, that's a third of the food production in the world is dependent to some extent on pollinators, and that's half of that's delivered by wild insects living freely in the wider ecosystem. So there's a number of reasons why nature can't be dispensed with and is actually needed for productive agriculture. And the third problem with this approach that says, oh, you can intensify agriculture by using more chemicals and going for the full-on high-yielding industrial agriculture then frees up land for nature. The third problem with this is that it doesn't free up land for nature because no one is in charge. No one is planning the world's food production at a global scale and deciding where the best place to produce different crops would be. And also what has been shown actually quite recently in a relatively new analysis is that in many parts of the world, and particularly with commodity crops like soybean, like oil palm and sugar, if you intensify production, what happens is not that you then free up land for nature. What happens is that you further expand agriculture. And this is something that economists would call a rebound effect. Basically, if you intensify, you make people richer, and when they've got a bit richer, they then invest in machinery and they then expand their estate and they then do more agriculture. So actually, it doesn't free up land for nature. So there's a number of reasons why the approach to intensifying agriculture in order to reverse biodiversity loss like that doesn't work, in my opinion. However, I think we do need to intensify the production, and there's a different way of doing that, which is what agroecology promises, because you can have higher yields if you go for smaller farms. There's actually a concept in the development agriculture literature, which is called the inverse farm size productivity relationship, which has been debated and discussed for many years. And what that basically shows is that the very small farms and the small plots and the small fields have a higher yield per unit area than the bigger farms and the bigger fields. And this is a consistent pattern in developing countries. Economists have scratched their heads trying to work it out because it seems counterintuitive. But it's one of the things that's really important in this. And the various reasons why that might be the case that are proposed are maybe the small plots have better soils, maybe they have more labor on them. None of these things always consistently explains this pattern. But the fact remains that if you break the farming system up from these big industrial fields into small fields, complex, diverse systems with lots of labor and lots of effort to produce things and diverse mixes of crops, you don't lose productivity on a per hectare basis. You can actually increase it or achieve the same kinds of levels. So there's a different way of doing the intensification. I think the main challenges, so the question also was, what are the main challenges and benefits to individual farmers of doing this, of going for agroecology? I mean, it's a huge change. Most farmers, especially the kind of commercial industrial farmers that I usually work with, don't know how to do this. They haven't been trained to do this. They've been trained to farm in a very kind of modern agronomic, machine-driven, industrial, chemical way, most farmers. And so making that transition is very difficult. It will need education, and it takes a little while to transition from this very intensive, large fields, not much diversity, to a diverse, stable, ecological type system that we were talking about at the start. Takes a few years, and the ecological research repeatedly shows that it takes a few years to recover. So if you start putting resources back in for pollinating insects, for example, they don't immediately respond. It takes 3 or 4, maybe 5 years for the populations to build up, because each year they have a new site, a new generation, and that generation is a little bit bigger than the one before, and populations build up. The same with soil carbon. If you reduce the tillage from a very regularly ploughed field to one that's not being regularly ploughed, and you cover the soil and you do the agroecological principles, it can actually take almost 10 years, the research that I know about shows, to get the soil carbon in the upper layers of the soil up to a much higher, consistently higher level. So you have this transition period, and that's a real challenge for farmers. There's also, agroecology relies on diversity. So it means that one of the things that's important about the diversity is that it means you can lose all of one crop to a massive pest outbreak in 1 year, and it doesn't kill your business. But making that transition to something that's very reliant on small number of particular crops, like in this country, most arable farmers are only growing 3 crops. Moving from that to growing 5 or 6 is a challenge, because you need different machinery and you need different systems, and you might be working with contractors who come in with their one big machine, and there isn't a contractor that does the kind of diverse multi-cropping system that you want to work with. So there's a lot of technical, logistical, business barriers to this kind of change. We talk about it as a systemic change. We need something that's quite a big systemic change to the way we manage landscape, and that's a socio-cultural change in the farming community as much as anything. And in terms of the benefits, I would just say the benefits of agroecology are resilience, resilience, resilience. It means that you're not very vulnerable to big price shocks, to big climate shocks. You have a whole diversity of different systems, and you're running a system that should have the kind of stability that we see in natural systems. And as well, you should be as productive as you were when you were conventional. I'll stop there.
Wow, big answer to a big question. Thank you very much for that, Lynn. And I guess, one of the challenges is also the dynamic, the power dynamic that exists between small scale farmers and agribusiness. So this brings me on to another question, which I'd like to pose to you, Jyoti. And this is from Caroline in France. She's concerned that the expansion of agribusiness has removed control over food production from farmers and led to the exploitation of the global south by Western countries. So she's asking, is it possible to have a revolution in sustainable food production and biodiversity conservation without the backing of agribusiness? And if not, how do we get their buy-in?
Well, I'm afraid buy-in is not what we're going to achieve. There's a competition out there, and the interests of big agribusinesses in the industrial model that's been supported by government for such a long time, they actually work against the interests of small scale farmers. And, it's not necessarily the farmers themselves. There's a lot of farmers that are trapped in a system that has been dominated by agribusiness influence for a long time. And, a wider global economic system that subsidizes industrial farming and doesn't subsidize small scale farms, that doesn't put research and development into agroecology, and does look at GM and fertilizers and robotics and things like that for a long time. But, those two different systems of agriculture do compete against each other, and that's got to be acknowledged. And you can't just play around the edges with industrial agriculture and expect the change to come from there. At the moment, working with Campesina in Europe, there's plenty of farmers that are practicing agroecology, new entrants to farmers starting farms like my own in Dorset. In England, it's a very mixed farm. We've got loads of different things going on here, lots of diversity of different plants and animals and vegetables all working together as a system. And that's a movement that's growing, even though it's smaller than the industrialized food system in Europe. But across the world, 70% of global food security comes from small-scale peasant farms, and 30% of the world's food is produced by the industrial food chain, but they're using 70% of agricultural resources. And there's a competition there. It's a competition for land, for water, for resources that government's putting forward, like subsidy or research and development budgets. And, you know, there's laws that these companies put into place that actually take away from the rights of small scale farmers to have their land and their resources to manage land sustainably. That has to be controlled. That is where, you know, as consumers, we can't just shop with our pocketbook to make a better food system. We actually have to demand wide structural change, that this destruction of the natural environment caused by these companies is controlled. We have to look at trade agreements where we stop the import of low standard products that can undercut good production. We need to have strict laws that the polluter pays. If you use too much nitrate fertilizer, if you use pesticides that are killing our insects, if you do these things, then you must pay or they must be banned. And we have to step up and really demand that this happens, because they're not going to voluntarily change these things on our own. Because, you know, the systems that agribusiness feeds into, the narratives that are done on a global level to try and support more export orientated agriculture that just makes, you know, more and more products that people have to eat, that take more and more resources to produce. All these things are fueled by a system where people make money out of food. And actually, small scale farmers that practice agroecology are producing food out of a sense of love for the land, love for the natural environment, wanting to feed their families and their communities and their regions with good, healthy, nutritious food. It's not about profit at all costs and how much can we make from producing so much on huge areas of land and exploiting our workers and exploiting the land by spreading chemicals all over it. It's much more about the values that we farm with, and that has to be controlled. Factory farms have to end. You know, we can put these rules into place as a society, but we have to demand that those things happen. You know, and as I said, it's not always the farmer's fault. Farmers are often caught in the middle of a system that have had to transition to these more industrialized food systems. And that can change too when we look at changing those policies, you know, so where we look at where our subsidy system is putting its money. Is it public money that's going for public goods, or is it public money going to support the biggest agribusiness corporations to trample over the rights of everyone else to have a decent planet for future generations? You know, and we think about that. Can we give training and research and development and support to get farmers onto a better path for agriculture so that we can feed the planet without destroying it? We know it's possible. We know the majority of our world's food is produced by small scale farmers using only 30% of agricultural resources managed sustainably. You know, how can we keep that model from being destroyed by the other model of agriculture? It's not just making that model grow, it's about stopping it from growing and destroying what we have. Okay.
And that leads nicely on to the practice of it, I think. And I'd like to turn to Alain here. There's a question here from Anna in Austria. So you're involved in the practice of agroecology a lot, right? And so it seems appropriate to ask you what her question, which is, how is it possible in a realistic time frame to actually transform this system back to a healthy agriculture which doesn't destroy nature?
Yes, good question. First, it's important to acknowledge that industrial farming systems didn't succeed in achieving food security. A bit less than 1 billion people are still hungry, so they are suffering from severe food insecurity, and their number is rising. And about 2 billion people are suffering from moderate or severe insecurity. And the conditions for feeding the world sustainably with agroecological systems are simple. First, we are wasting 30 to 50% of our food in developed and in developing countries. And so there are huge possibilities to reduce that, especially in developed countries. We should reduce a little bit our meat consumption. Livestock consume about 2/3 of grain produced on this planet. And so there is a livestock people competition for cereals and soybean, for instance. And for achieving that, we should mainly feed ruminants with grass and pig and poultry with grass too, but also with human food waste. Two important publications show that organic farming can feed the world. One is from 2007 and the other from 2017, and probably they will be available on the web through the system. Another showed that agroecology can feed the world, can feed Europe and still export agricultural products. It's the TIFA publication for 2018. And it's also important to realize that food insecurity is more a social and political problem than a technical agronomic problem. And since agroecology promotes the rights of small farmers, as Jyoti just said, and organize the majority of food production at regional or national level, food resilience increases. So that's the reason justify why a transition towards agroecological systems are necessary. And we said already that the ecological strategy of agroecology consists in replacing fossil fuel-based inputs such as nitrogen, fertilizer and pesticide by ecosystem services provided by biodiversity. This may look a bit theoretical, but actually it's very simple. It means that we should replace nitrogen fertilizer by nitrogen fixation by legumes, use more cover crops, develop an ecological network for increasing the population of natural enemies of crop pests, for replacing pesticide, for instance. We should stop destroying soils and soil life by intensive tillage, plowing, for instance, and we should feed soil life. We should also feed animals with local resources, integrating crop and livestock production, that's important. And we should also reform the food chain. It's not just an agricultural issue, it's also a food issue. And agroecology can do that by producing high quality products, healthy products, which can be sold at a higher prices, price higher for the farmers, but not necessarily for the consumers. Products should be processed at farm and regional level whenever possible, and products should be marketed in short and local marketing chains mainly. And that provides a better income to farmers. So that's the way for encouraging that, well, the kind of transition that should be adopted by farmers for achieving a better income. But of course, transition is difficult, and because many things have to be changed, knowledge has to be acquired during this transition phase. And for instance, in Europe, the current Common Agricultural Policy should be reformed for replacing the direct aid per hectare and per livestock head with a basic income per full-time equivalent working on a farm. And that is an efficient tool for supporting small farmers. Actually, about 80% of the subsidies are captured by 20% of large farms. So it's an unfair system. And a subsidy per person would be much more fair and efficient. Public money should also be spent for producing public goods. It means remunerating farmers for the creation of public, or also called common goods, especially for the three main of them: carbon sequestration in agricultural soils, restoration of rural biodiversity, and development of the ecological network, but also for the support of different forms of biodiversity. And the transition should be specifically supported by a redistribution of investment aid to allow the creation of a new fund to facilitate the purchase of agroecological tools and equipment. We should also design a system that facilitates the access to land and the installation of young farmers and market gardeners for creating their own agroecological business. We should reinforce short and local marketing chains and develop a training network with well-trained advisors and a network also of innovative farms that could be used as an example for farmers who are involved in the transition. All these measures are important for promoting and implementing agroecological systems in Europe. It could be a bit different in other countries, but in each country we should first avoid spend money for detrimental systems. For instance, nitrogen fixation, the industrial nitrogen fixation should not be subsidized anymore. We should first avoid to finally destroy the system, and then we can implement the transition. Thank you.
Thanks, Alain. Yeah, you touched on animal agriculture there, and it's a topic that's coming up quite a lot in our questions, unsurprisingly. I want to make sure that we don't spend the whole talk on that, because there's so much more to agroecology than just the role of animal agriculture. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to read a few questions that have come in on that. And if any of you want to come in on a particular aspect of that, you think there's something that's particularly important and useful to say, then please do. So we have a question from Sonia Lowell, who's asking if we dramatically reduced our meat intake and therefore the amount of land needed to feed our livestock, how far would this go to solving the problem of deforestation? We've also got a question from Rue Kenyon from the UK, who is asking about regenerative grazing. And to what extent that can sequester carbon in soils. There's a question from James Bullock, also from the UK, who asks, switching to a vegan diet assumes we will have enough land to grow crops. How will this work, given that much of the land used for livestock farming, such as in the west of England, is unsuitable for crop growing? And then a real broad stroke here from Diane Bennett in the UK: is a plant-based diet, particularly in the Western world, the answer to reducing the environmental impact of the agricultural sector? Jyoti, do you want to say a few words?
Yeah, definitely. I think, when we talk about livestock, as a farmers union, we're not anti-livestock at all, but we have a clear differentiation between different methods of raising livestock. We feel like livestock has an important role to play in sustainable agriculture in terms of building fertility, in terms of using up waste products, in terms of being able to use land that might be more marginal or not useful for other crops to be grown. But there's a significant problem with the amount of land taken up by livestock feed. So much land is used for growing soya and grains and different animal feed products on land that should be back to nature. It should be forests or other ecosystems, or it could be land that should be there for peasant farms to be able to produce crops for themselves, rather than exporting feed for European animals. And so, when we look at the different livestock systems, we clearly feel that we need to move away from factory farms and grain-fed livestock. And we've done a lot of calculations for, looking at land use and working out how we get down to a sustainable land use where we can have enough land to create nature recovery networks and rewild bits of land and plant the trees that we need to sequester carbon. And it's clear that we really need to reduce meat consumption by about 50% from our calculations. That does not mean we're against meat consumption at all, but it does mean we do need to reduce how much is eaten. And so everybody really needs to think about changing their diets to that. But it's about how that meat that you do eat is raised, eating less but better meat, and making sure that the animals that are raised on loads of grain that's trading off with food that should be there for humans to consume, and the land it takes up, isn't what you eat. That you eat, if you're eating pigs and chickens, which are the grain consumers rather than pasture fed, then think about pigs and chickens that are raised on waste products only, byproducts of primarily arable or vegetable systems. And with mixed farming systems, that's possible. Chickens can eat bits of scraps, pigs can eat waste, and that means that they're not, they're using that waste in a sustainable way instead of competing with humans for that food. If it's cows and lamb that you're eating, then those should be pasture fed, 100% pasture fed, and that pasture should be pasture that's looked after, so that it's got nice deep soil that sequesters carbon, and land that isn't suitable for arable production. So think about, is it helping with conservation grazing? Is it helping with restoring wildflower meadows, or on marginal land if you're eating meat that comes from pasture fed animals? And otherwise, cut it out of your diet, because that other forms of meat from factory farms and grain-fed meat is not sustainable.
Brilliant, thanks, Jyoti. So I'm very keen that we get to a few more questions, and we've probably only got 10 or 15 minutes for that. But if I saw Marco had a hand there, and Alain, you want to come back on that. So just spend a minute adding your thoughts to that.
Yes, I just want to confirm that livestock is very important for developing sustainable systems and agroecological systems. This crop livestock integration, that is the key. And of course, we should reduce our meat production and consumption. But I just want to say that we will not be able to feed mankind if we don't produce livestock at all. For instance, about 50% of the global agricultural area is grassland. These grasslands are on soils that cannot be cropped because they are very sensitive to erosions, or for several reasons. And so if we stop production on half of the agricultural area, we will never succeed in feeding the global population.
Thanks, Alain. Do you want to come in quickly, Marco?
Yes, very quickly. I agree with almost everything that has been said. There's been a major Oxford study coming out. Many people remember that has very nicely highlighted the huge differences of impact between the worst producer, in a sense, and the best ones. So we may reduce a lot, enormously, how much animal protein we consume, especially from bovine meats and goat meats, as has been said. And if we target the worst producers, the most impactful producers in terms of CO2 emissions and in terms of land use change, then we could only keep the best ones, and only on the marginal lands, as my colleagues have said. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Marco. All right, so we're going to go to some quick-fire questions now. So please try and keep your response down to a minute, and we'll get through some of the new questions that we've got coming in. And this one is a simple but very, very important question. I wonder if this might be best directed towards Marco. And that is simply from a mysterious no-named individual on Twitter in the UK. How badly is our soil actually being damaged?
Okay, thank you very much. Very badly. We're losing a lot. We're losing a lot by erosion. We're losing a lot of organic matter. Organic matter is dwindling. In some of the areas, like where I come from, near where I come from, in all of the north of Italy, there has been a calculation made by colleagues of mine that actually what the intensive agriculture in the plain of the Po Valley River and all of the north of Italy is basically only about 10 to 15% coming out of ecosystem services, meaning the rest of it is destruction of soil that is poor in structure, that is very poor in carbon, and only produces because of fossil fuels and pesticides and inputs from fertilizer, etc. So yes, the soil is in a very bad condition. We need to reverse completely the way we treat it.
Brilliant. Thanks, Marco. I'm going to move to another question, and I think this one might work well for Lynn. This question comes from Uti in Finland, who's asking about technology. Is there room for lab-grown food in our future? And I'd like to expand that out to other biotechnologies that are billed as part of this precision farming revolution, smart robots, automation, Internet of Things. It seems like there's a sort of a parting of approaches here between the technosphere and the biosphere. So can you speak a little bit to that and what direction we should be heading?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question. I think you're right. There is a parting of ways, or potentially, but also there's a future where we combine the nature with the technology, which I think is what we should be trying to embrace. Some technologies are good in the context of agroecology, and others not so good. In terms of food supply, I think that we need to look at everything. We need to look at all possibilities, and if there are ways of making food that are not agricultural, then we should certainly be considering those. However, what we need to do is make sure we look intelligently at the full life cycle assessment for the environmental impacts of all of the processes we might imagine, because we haven't got a particularly strong history of industry producing a solution that is more sustainable than what we had before. What tends to happen is that some big new solution comes and everyone thinks it's great, and then it turns out to be really terrible for the environment because of some unforeseen impacts that we didn't realize. And the best example of that is biofuels, which were actually very heavily promoted. Oil and burning in your car, they were heavily promoted in Europe and in Brazil as a way of replacing fossil fuels, because they come from plants that are grown, so therefore it's carbon neutral. But in fact, the full balance of environmental impact of those turned out to be really terrible, because they generated a lot of land use change. And what we ended up with was massive destruction of rainforests on peat in Southeast Asia, for example. So that's one example of where what appears to be a solution isn't necessarily, and we really need to think very carefully about anything that's proposed. So on technology, there's a lot of things coming, like robotic software on combine harvesters, for example, that can only fertilize where you need fertilizer. That seems like it might reduce fertilizer use and make things a bit more efficient. My feeling about that is it probably homogenizes the environment a little bit more, so I'm not completely sure it's a solution. One thing that I've really been quite annoyed by in recent years is the proposal that we can replace insect pollinators with drones, either flying individual tiny bees or drones that spray pollen across crops as a way of pollinating fruit if we can't rely on insects anymore. And this is just a crazy idea, because it's not better than what we have, which is millions upon millions of wild free living insects that do that service very, very well indeed, and do it for free. So I think we have to be very circumspect about technological solutions, but they might exist. We have a lot more information than we used to have about what's going on in agricultural fields, about the health of crops. We have all this imagery from satellites, we have images from drones, and we can plan more carefully. We can plan landscapes at farm scale to provide resources, for example, for insects, so that there are technologies that could be really good in moving forward with agroecology and getting more intelligent and better at managing a system. But I don't think that technology should be assumed to be able to provide the answers necessarily. Another example I can give is the genetically modified crops, which are often talked about in this context as kind of providing a solution, because we could have more nutritious varieties of crops, we can have more disease resistance, we can have salt tolerant varieties of rice, and so on. What you actually see in the market is two main genetically modified types of crops, and they're either herbicide tolerant, and they're sold by companies that also sell the herbicide that they're tolerant to. And those have a negative impact on farm wildlife because they reduce the number of weeds and increase herbicide use. And the other type is insect resistant crops, which have within them a toxin which reduces insecticide use by making the plant itself more toxic to insects. Now, those insect tolerant crops, insect resistant GM crops, actually do have a slight benefit for insects in many circumstances, because you reduce the pesticide use in the fields, but they also run the risk of developing resistance, which is a problem we have faced for a long time with insecticides. Insects are very resourceful. There are many, many, many of them, and they evolve quite quickly to resist anything that's thrown at them. So what has happened is that insect tolerant crops have generated resistance, and then farmers start using both the crop and pesticides, so it doesn't always have the desired effect. I'll stop there.
Brilliant, thanks, Lynn. I think that's a really, really important issue that we need to be abreast of. So we're running out of time. I want to give everyone a chance to go and give their 2-minute take homes, what they'd really like viewers to come away with. But I just want to go to one final question that is really important. And it's about what we can do. So I'll send this one over to Jyoti, and let's make this nice, short and sweet, so we've got some time for take homes, and it's quite a good specific ask, and I'd like anyone else who has some ideas on this to come forward. And that question is, let me find that one. So this question is from Josie Olsen in New Zealand. And the question is, what are the specific programs or methods of sustainable farming that we can name when we ask our governments to change agriculture for the better? What should we be asking for?
Oh, agroecology. Yeah, it's pretty simple. Here in the UK, we've been making a real push. We have an agricultural bill going through at the moment to look at how we reform the common agricultural policy we got from Europe. And what we've been doing is explaining very carefully to government, to lots of people who don't know what agroecology means, taking it back and really breaking it down and saying, this is what it means. And it's all about the ecological benefits of what we do, but there's also a sociological dimension in that, agroecology supports small farms, it supports small farm livelihoods, and it supports a better rural economy and gets more people into contact with nature. And that's something not to forget as well, that it helps transform society so we get an equal a more equality in society and a better, fairer food system where everybody has a right to healthy, affordable food. And so, breaking it down, saying what it means and asking for agroecology, and we need a complete transformation to an agroecological, fair food system for everybody.
Brilliant, thanks, Jyoti. Does anyone want to come in briefly on Marco?
Yes, thank you. Yes, agroecology, as Josie say. What does it mean? It means that we must to follow the rules, the laws of ecology. So the soil is never labored, it's always kept covered. We do away with monoculture, we do away with fertilizer, we do away with pesticides. Full stop. We can grow crops without a single drop of pesticide, without a single drop of fertilizer, just using the natural system. Using the natural system in terms of what the soil gives, in terms of enhancing natural fertility. If you put mulch on top of soil and you leave spontaneous plant, keeping them a bit at bay with mulch, then the soil is alive and provides the services you need. If you then have plants that are healthy and you don't need to spread pesticide because they don't need it. And then you keep the system in equilibrium so that pest predators are dealing with each other nicely, and there is enough for everyone. And then you have system, contrary to what sometimes it seems, if you adopt all the principle of agroecology, not just a tiny little one and not the other, because research has proven that if you just say stop tilling, but do not do the rest of the practices and approaches and keep everything else the same, then you reduce yield. But if you do tilling and you use cover crops and you use rotation and you have combined polycultures and you do all these things together, then you have a complete complex system. And you have examples that are studied in the literature. I make just one example. Rice grown together with azolla species, nitrogen fixing species, with compost, with no fertilizer and no pesticide, in a ponds where fish swim and duck as well is there. Then if you take only just the productivity of the single grain of rice and you just count for rice, you can go from, if you grow monoculture, you have 400 grams of rice per square meter. If you have this complex system, you have over a kilogram, that's 2.5 more, 2.5 times more. And then in the complex system, what you have is also protein, some fish and duck. And this is just one of several examples. When you mimic nature, you are a win-win-win in all the time. Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks, Marco. So it sounds like we're talking about the stuff that is really important to us in the short term. And I'd like to sort of combine this with our 2-minute take homes. So Lynn, you had something that you wanted to add, and yeah, please wrap it up with what you'd like to leave viewers with.
Yeah, so I wanted to say I wouldn't like us to appear to be too optimistic here. There is a general consensus, I think, in the scientific literature that organic farming, which uses no chemicals at all in the way it's currently practiced, tends to have a yield penalty, tends to produce about 20% less food than conventional intensive farming with chemicals. It's not true in every system. So if you have a complex system and you've got legumes in that are really well used, you don't have this yield penalty. So it's system dependent. But what we need to do with farming is really very systemic changes. And I wanted to say before that technology will be a really important part of that. I think it's unrealistic to propose that everything is going to be done by hand and we will move away from mechanized agriculture, but to move from where we are to complex agriculture with diverse cropping systems is going to require some real ingenuity in agricultural engineering. And I think we have that capability. We just need to work on it, to focus on that. Let's have machines that can harvest, and I know they exist, that can harvest mixed crops, for example, at a smaller scale, that can move easily in small fields, and that kind of thing is really important. I think to sum up, I'd just like to say we need to keep producing food. Humans need to eat, and it's not about need. We will keep producing food, but what we need to do is stop destroying natural habitat on a global scale in order to produce the food we want. So we might need to change what we eat, and we probably have to get more intelligent about the way that we produce food. The agriculture we are all moving towards at the moment globally, or have been for the last 50 years, is not resilient. It is an unstable system. It's very vulnerable economically, and it's not the best way that humans can produce large quantities of food. So we need this systemic change. And the only way we're going to get there is through a coherent policy and business changing together, everyone talking to each other and just learning all the time, investing in research, investing in agricultural education, and trying to move away from where we are towards this more knowledge intensive, nature-based agriculture. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thanks, Lynn. I would like to go to Jyoti's final thoughts, and if you don't mind, Jyoti, I'd like to combine this with a question that's just come in very recently that I think you could add some real value to, and that is around La Via Campesina. So they've been campaigning for a long time on agroecology and food and seed sovereignty, says Ronan from the UK. He's asking, how can we do better at building bridges with the likes of XR, and how could and should XR support peasants and small-scale farmers around the world? So if you could give me your 1 minute whistle-stop tour on that, please.
Well, I mean, hopefully, the values that XR can learn from La Via Campesina and the amount of grassroots mobilization and action across the world since the 1980s, and the beginning of the anti-globalization movement, and how much we've achieved by working together as a social movement, working on so many different levels. I think, what's important to think about with La Via Campesina is maybe a little bit opposite of what Lynn just said about, technology, in that, the robots and things in the fields, okay, maybe that's one solution, but we've got a tremendous, we've got a huge global population and a lot of people that need jobs, and a lot of people with skills and knowledge that they've, been cultivating over the centuries. And I think it's very important to learn from those traditional land-based systems and build on those and build those skills and capabilities, and for people to just get into farming, really support buying the best food you can, get into farming if you can, get some land and develop these systems, and then support the global movement, become an advocate for supporting agroecology, make sure our development budgets support more agroecology, our trade rules support agroecology, our farming subsidy systems, and that we put some firm rules into place to stop agribusiness, impacting on all the small farmers that are actually doing the work to feed this planet in a sustainable way. We can speak up and we can make a difference if we all work together on that. Don't just focus on what it is that you eat. Focus on the wide systemic change we need to bring agroecology and peasant farmers to the forefront of our narrative.
Wow. Inspirational. Thanks, Jyoti. So I'd like to go to Alain, your final thoughts, and I'd like to just bring in one final question as well. Maybe you might want to speak to this in your final thoughts, from Elina Latseva in the Netherlands, who talks about how many farms and farmers are actually dependent on loans from banks. And maybe in your final thoughts, you could talk about what impacts this is having on the agricultural system, and if that's a cycle that we need to break, and how.
Yes, in agroecology, we try to limit investments and thus loans. But even if farmers have loans, because agroecology is more profitable than industrial systems, and we have recently demonstrated that in a paper, you can more easily reimburse your loan if you shift to agroecology. For my take-home message, I would say, yes, agroecology can feed the world because it is productive. It's more productive than conventional systems in developing countries. It's a bit less productive than industrial agriculture in developed countries, especially for cereals. But we have huge buffers. If we reduce a bit our meat consumption, if we stop feeding animals with human foods, with grain, with cereal grains, soybean, we can spare a lot of land for producing human food. And we should stop transforming human food into biofuels. It does not make sense at all. And if we do that, we have this huge buffer. I mean, we can even reduce the overall production. And yes, compared to industrial systems, agroecology improves the status of most or all environmental parameters, including greenhouse gas emissions, soil carbon sequestration, soil fertility, biodiversity conservation, water and air pollution. When you shift to agroecology, all the environmental indicators are improving. And again, the third thought is that agroecology is more profitable even in developed countries. We have just to organize the transition that is a more difficult period.
Brilliant, thanks, Alain. Okay, Marco, the floor is yours for one final thought.
Well, thank you. We've known how to grow crops in agroecology for decades. So now it's a matter of doing what is necessary. What is necessary for what? We are heading towards disaster, both for climate disruption and ecological disaster. We are heading for the sixth mass extinction. We have to change. We should stop seeing what is possible and doable and reasonable to ask policymakers. It's daunting that it doesn't seem to get to the penny doesn't go down for policymakers. The biodiversity strategy has just come out from the EU now. There's one mention of the word agroecology, just one. It's almost paying lip service to that. So there seems to nothing to be done about it after all these decades of scientists' warning. So we seem to be facing a situation where the only thing that seems able to save us is nonviolent mass civil disobedience. So that my take-home message is, because we know how to feed the world without destroying it, but we're not doing it, join the Extinction Rebellion and trying to push the big change that we need to do to save the planet. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Marco. A nice note to leave it on. So thank you very much to all our panelists, and most importantly to all of you. There'd be no point in doing this but for you. And you know, big apologies to those whose questions we didn't get to answer. There's a huge amount to talk about, and as you can see, we've already run over. So thank you for being here. Keep an eye out for our next event, which is going to be called Tipping Points. What should we be afraid of? The date on that is to be confirmed, but do keep an eye out on relevant social media streams. And we're also going to be releasing on social media some links and useful information, extra stuff. We've been keeping an eye on requests for references in the questions, so keep an eye out for that. And if you're interested to learn more, then you have a treasure trove awaiting you. So all that leaves me to say is thank you again to our panelists and to you, and it's goodbye from me.